So I'm going to talk today about a project that I completed for the Joint Fire Science Program several months ago that had to do with evaluating the outcomes of fire research, or specifically research that's been funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. And really, this is a question that I was asking: do managers use science that the program has funded? And I should say that, so originally we had designed this to give kind of a southwestern perspective. We were going to have this presentation followed up by a presentation from Craig Wilcox to sort of talk about his experience working with scientists in the region and how that's kind of facilitated use of science. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today, so I'm sorry for all of you that were expecting to hear from Craig. We're certainly going to miss his perspective, but I think what we'll do instead, and I know Xander alluded to this, is just following this hopefully kind of short presentation, we'll have a kind of a broader discussion with all of you on the phone on your perspectives on what can facilitate the application of science. So I look forward to everyone's input. I guess I also mentioned that there is a paper out now that highlights the results of this research that was in International Journal of Wildland Fire published over the summer. I don't have the reference here, but if any of you are interested, my email address is there, and just shoot me a line and I'll be happy to get you a copy. Okay, I guess I remember how to do it, yeah. So a little background first on the Joint Fire Science Program, if you're not as familiar with it. It was established in 1998 by Congress, and the joint stands for really having a joint governance of the U.S. Forest Service and several bureaus and offices under the Department of Interior. And this is its mission. I guess I'll read it out because it is a little scrunched there. So, provide credible research tailored to the needs of fire and fuels managers, to engage and listen to clients and develop focused strategic lines of new research responsive to those needs, to solicit proposals from scientists who compete for funding through a rigorous peer review process designed to ensure that the best projects are funded, and to focus on science delivery when the research is completed with a suite of communication tools to ensure that managers are aware of, understand, and can use the information to make sound decisions and implement projects. So since then, since its inception, there's been over $150 million awarded and over 600 projects. And the subject matter is wide-ranging and really encompasses kind of most of what you can think of when you think of wildland fire. So effectiveness of fuel treatments, ecological effects of fire and fuel treatments, historical fire regimes, post-fire management, smoke management, and social and economic aspects of fire and fuels management. And as the mission stated, science delivery has always been a important component of the program, but the investment in science delivery really increased quite substantially in 2009 when the Fire Science Exchange Network was established. And Xander already gave you a background on that and the map and everything, so I won't get into that. Now, I think one of the strengths of the program is really its commitment to self-evaluation. And one aspect of that is every 4 or 5 years or so, JFSP solicits a group of people, outside individuals, to conduct a review of the program to kind of identify the strengths and weaknesses and areas where the program can improve. And really the impetus of this assessment came out of comments of a program review, actually really several program reviews. All of them kind of were similar to what's given here at the top. JFSP should include greater emphasis on describing the value of outcomes of the program in addition to outputs. And in order to kind of highlight what the difference between those are, those difference between outcomes and outputs, I included this logic model. This is just an example of what a logic model could look like for a program like JFSP. And if you're not familiar with this, it's really just it's sort of a graphic that's commonly used in program evaluation, and it really all it represents are, you know, the inputs that a program has. So that could be, for in this case, funding or funding for science and science dissemination, and a, you know, program office staff. And then the outputs are basically the activities and products that result from those inputs. So, you know, science can result in journal articles. All the work that the exchanges do result in training and workshops and briefs and syntheses and things of that nature. But the outputs are really kind of what you, the expected change or benefit that you want to see as a result of those inputs and outputs. And they're broken up into short and medium and long term. So in the short term, we can expect, as a result of all those outputs, that perhaps there would be a change in manager awareness or knowledge about the science. In the medium term, you hope that that change in awareness would lead to change in action. So they would actually be used in decision making, for example. And then in the long term, ultimately you expect that that's going to lead to a change in condition on the ground. So a change in the environment, or perhaps change in some society aspect. And so what this quote is really getting at is saying, you know, JFSP has done a good job of kind of evaluating their outputs, and you know, we have good numbers for how many of these things are produced every year and whatnot, but not necessarily really great information on what the impact of all of those outputs have been, what the outcomes have been. And this is common actually for programs, and the reason for that is it's very easy to track outputs. It's very easy to count the numbers of publications and numbers of trainings and whatnot. But it's a lot more difficult to really demonstrate what the impact of all of those things have been. And so the purpose of this assessment was to try to understand that a little bit more. What have been some of the particularly short and medium term outcomes of science that's been produced by JFSP? And it focuses on short and medium term actions because, as you might imagine, long-term changes are much, much more difficult to evaluate, and they really require much longer time frames. Because some of these expected changes in condition, in some cases, these might take decades to really be fully seen. So in this assessment, really focusing on you know, whether or not the science has led to changes in awareness and changes in action. Okay, so these are the specific objectives of the study. One, to determine the extent to which findings from research funded by JFSP has been used in decisions regarding fire and fuels management. So basically what I wanted to know if managers are aware of the science and if they've used it in some capacity. And then a secondary objective was to explore factors that influence the application of science. So, for example, if we were to find that the science has been used, then what are some of the factors that have facilitated the use of that science? If it has not been used, then why? What are some factors that perhaps have acted as barriers to the application of science? So those are some of the things that I also tried to explore. Okay, so how did I do this? Basically, I looked at a random sample of completed JFSP projects, 48 projects in total. And to get kind of a wide geographic representation of projects, I looked at 2 to 4 projects per region, and those were regions that were defined by the boundaries of the Fire Science Exchange Network. And then, but any project had to meet these parameters that are listed here. So they had to be completed before 2011. So at the time, I think they would have been at least 4 years old. And the reason for this is there's lots of study that says it simply takes time for science to be disseminated and for changes in awareness to result in that. So we wouldn't necessarily expect a project that's completed to right away be you know, understood and used by managers. So we wanted to look at projects that were a little bit older. And then they had to have a minimum of, resulted in a minimum of 3 projects. One would have had to have been a peer review publication, and at least 2 deliverables that are intended for managers. So that could be a brief or a workshop or field trip or something like that. And again, the reason I kind of set those parameters in place is because I thought it wouldn't be too surprising to us if we found that, you know, for a project where there was no deliverable, no outreach to managers, that managers wouldn't be aware of it. That wouldn't be a really novel finding. I should say that, though, that at least from the product standpoint, a vast majority of JFSP funded projects do indeed result in at least a peer review publication and some products for managers. Okay, and then so for each of those 48 projects, I used multiple lines of evidence to kind of figure out whether or not the science that resulted from those projects is being used by managers and how. The first off, I conducted a web survey of boundary spanners. And if you're not familiar with that term, boundary spanners are really just folks that kind of serve the role as acting as a bridge between science and management. So some examples of this could be, you know, fire ecologists who work within agencies, extension specialists, certainly the people that are working for all the Fire Science Exchange network I would consider boundary spanners. And I chose to focus on this rather limited population because I suspected that they would have the most knowledge not only of the science, because that's a key part of their job is keeping up with the latest fire science, but also that they would have a really good understanding of whether or not the science has been used, because in addition to keeping up with the science, they're also tightly connected to the management community. So I contacted a number of boundary spanners in each of the different regions and asked them to complete the survey. And in that survey, they were asked about their knowledge about these specific 48 projects. I also contacted the principal investigators of those projects to kind of get their perspective on whether or not the science they produced had been used. And then for a subsample of the boundary spanners who completed the survey, I conducted a phone interview. And the purpose of that was to really just get more in-depth information about the use of science for these particular projects and what might have acted as facilitators or barriers to the use of science. And then the final sort of line of evidence that I looked at was planning documents. So I basically gathered a number of planning documents from across the country and just looked at the citations to see if they were actually using papers that have resulted from these 48 projects. Okay, so the first thing that I assessed in the boundary spanner survey is just whether or not the respondent was aware of the project. So what I would do is kind of provide a brief description of the project, you know, the PI and some key publications that resulted from it, and then simply I would ask, were you aware of this work? And then if they were aware of it, then the survey would go on and ask them follow-up questions about how that actual science has been used or not used by managers. So for so of those 48 projects, for 37 of projects, there was at least some awareness of the science on the part of the boundary spanner. So that means at least for those projects, for that sample 37, we have some additional information about how the science was or was not used. And this is showing kind of results of the survey from both the perspective of the boundary spanner and the PI. So the boundary spanners is the first column there. And this is the answer to the question, how has information from this project been used by managers? And so the N is basically 37 projects for the boundary spanners, because for 37 of those projects there was some awareness of the science. And then 21 for the PI, that's just the number of PIs that responded to the survey. So that's also the number of projects for which we have some information from the PIs. And this is kind of what they said. So the most commonly cited means of use for the science was being used in the planning process, also closely followed by being used to inform treatment prescriptions and an evaluation of current practices. And one thing that I found kind of interesting is that both the boundary spanners and the PI tended to kind of agree that those were the most commonly ways in which science was used by managers. And then other less cited means by which the science was used was to inform models or decision support tools and to inform policy. A few projects had been used to inform policy, but not the majority. And then this is response to the question, have you encountered any of these general barriers that prevented the use of research? And again, there tended to be pretty good agreement between the boundary spanners and the PI, at least in terms of kind of the most important barriers. So the first one was that managers are not aware of the research. So even though the boundary spanner might be aware, they would often say that the vast majority of managers within their region weren't aware of the science, and that was a significant barrier. Another, that the managers don't have time or resources to kind of learn about the science and incorporate it into management. There's uncertainty in the science that was listed a little bit more frequently by the principal investigators compared to the boundary spanners. And then other things that were listed a little not quite as frequently were political or social barriers within or outside of the organization, the science not being relevant to management, or the science not being compatible with current management objectives. And then I also followed up that survey with, again, with interviews with a subset of the boundary spanners who responded to the survey. I ended up doing 10 telephone interviews, and in those interviews I was able to discuss 25 of the projects that were in that sample of 48. And basically what I did was recorded the interviews and had them transcribed, and then did just a really simple coding exercise, basically kind of tallying the number of times that a particular particular answer had been given in response to any questions that I had. So for this one, it's how has the research been used in management, just getting more in-depth information than what was used in the survey, but actually got pretty similar responses to the survey, that in most projects it said it's used heavily in the planning process. It's when managers are really seeking out science. In some cases, the interviews responded that the projects, for 8 of them, actually led to changes in field treatment practices. So, and in some cases this was a subtle change. It might be kind of a tweak in a prescription, but in some cases this was a pretty substantial change, like applying fire to landscapes that really hadn't been a management practice previously, or at least for decades. So. This I thought was kind of an exciting finding, in that it's one thing that shows that not only is the science resulting in some of those short-term outcomes that we would expect, like changes in awareness and behavior, but is also leading to some actual changes in action, some of those medium-term outcomes. Others indicated that that for 5 of these projects, people indicated that the science supported treatment practices, so it didn't necessarily lead to changes in the way how people were doing things, but it supported what they were doing. And actually, I think the boundary spanners regarded that as quite important, because when you get into litigation and things like that, having that support can be really important. For 6 of the projects, the boundary spanners indicated that to their knowledge, the science had not been used. So they were aware of the work, but weren't aware of it being applied in any capacity. I also asked what facilitated the application of science from the project, and the most commonly cited reason was that the science was highly relevant to manage it and manager needs. So I think the research questions were carefully framed so that they would really be applicable to managers. Also, lots of dissemination, different types of dissemination. So having good outreach material, events for managers, that was cited a lot. But particularly outreach in terms of having direct interaction between managers and researchers. In some cases that was cited as being really important. Having that kind of personal connection goes a long way in getting science understood by managers and applied on the ground. In some cases, people said that other managers played a key role in kind of communicating science to their peers. So that's kind of the paper that gets passed around the email chain. That can happen a lot and can be important. People identified the importance of boundary spanners. People like, the Fire Science Exchange Network, the important work that they're doing to help facilitate information exchange. Some people also said that it's important that a study was conducted in their area. So that's what that localized study means. The fact that someone has something from their particular region that they can cite is really important. And then this is the final results that I'll present today. This is what I found in looking at planning documents. So I looked at hundreds of planning documents from a number, across the country, federal, state, county units. And basically this is just showing the number of projects in which that had papers that were cited in planning documents. So that first number is projects that were cited in more than one planning document. So that kind of indicates repeated use anyway. The number that were cited at least found in one planning document. The number that were cited in more than one region, which kind of indicates a broader scope of applicability. And then fewer numbers were cited by publications produced by advocacy organizations or policy documents. So just to conclude, if I could answer kind of the question that was posed at the beginning, do managers use science? I think that we can conclude, yes, that they are using the science that's been produced by JFSP to some capacity. And I think if you consider all of those methods that I looked at, the interviews and the surveys, the PI survey and the boundary spanner survey and the planning documents, there is at least some evidence of use for 44 of the 48 projects that were in that larger sample of 48. And as I indicated, I think the study shows that fire science has resulted in both short-term and medium-term outcomes. So not only have we seen changes in awareness, but also in some cases changes in decision-making, changes in management practices. So you could see kind of the trajectory of the logic model. And some of the reasons for that include the fact that JFSP research is seen as highly relevant to managers, and also this focus on outreach, and really particularly this focus on, I think, developing relationships and interactions between managers and scientists and boundary spanners. It goes a long way, and I think there's some evidence in this assessment that that's really important. And I thought, one way that I could end this is to just make a couple of important points that I think came out of the assessment. And these are things that I think, at least from the scientist perspective, that they've done right to assure that the science has been applied. One thing that this, and I think other studies highlight, again, is that importance of engaging managers, developing that personal relationship and that interaction. And I think in a lot of cases this is especially important at the beginning of the project, so that you can be assured that the questions that you're asking are relevant to managers. And also I think that one thing that's come up in this project is recognizing the importance of boundary spanners and boundary organizations. They came up a lot in the interview process, and I think it comes back to kind of developing those relationships so that people understand each other. One of my favorite quotes that came out of the interview that I think really highlights the importance of this relationship is someone said, the fire community is very much an I know you, I trust you community. So you need to have that trust established so that, managers know who to turn to, can trust who they turn to, and trust the science and understand how to use it. I think that's all I have. So I don't know, Xander, at this point you want to?
Yeah, let me jump in. And first I want to thank you. I think that's the research itself was really important, and so I'm glad that you took the bull by the horns and did the work to pull out these numbers. And I also think you did a nice job of presenting them in a clear way. So thank you for that as well. And maybe we'll do a few just sort of questions about the presentation first. And so I urge folks on the line, if you have a question about what Molly presented or want more details, go ahead and type it in the chat window. And then maybe we'll move from there to a more wide-ranging conversation. And just as a warning, I know some of you on the phone, and I won't hesitate to call you out to ask you for examples where you've seen either research you've done, Andy, Don, or helped make that transition. And Stacy, maybe you can bring some examples from California. And then folks maybe more on the management side, I see Richard's name on the list here. Folks like that, if you can think about examples where you've either taken a piece of research and put it into your management plan or made a different decision about something happening on the ground because of a piece of research, I think those would be great to share. But first, before we dive into that and to give you a minute to sort of formulate your thinking, I personally have a question, and that's around, forgive me if I missed this, but you were looking at all kinds of products, right, Molly? You didn't differentiate between, say, journal article and GTR. Is that correct?
That's right. And actually, so I was looking for projects that had at least 3 products, and in terms of what could constitute a project, a deliverable for a manager, it could have been a whole host of things, from a webinar to a GTR to a field trip, any number of things. But I did want there to be at least one peer-reviewed publication that resulted from it as well.
And I guess the reason I asked the question is I'm curious about how different kinds of outputs, specifically that big line between the peer-reviewed journal article, which is sort of the gold standard in academia, and everything else, and how the different products are used. And one example might be, does it matter if a researcher shares what he or she learned or found out via a Forest Service publication? Does that get used more, or does that get used less for management? And it sounds like that's not a question that this particular research was ready to answer, but maybe, Molly, if you could comment on whether you feel like that's a fruitful avenue for future research, or if other people are working on it, or maybe I'm off on a tangent and it doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and like any study, I came out of it with a lot more questions like that that I think need to be addressed. My sense is that I think those kinds of products, and I don't have good information of all of the products that are geared towards managers, which ones are most effective, which ones do they use the most? I think that's a really valid question. I do also get the sense, though, when you get into planning and litigation, having a peer-reviewed publication is really key. So that's at least, one area where that particular product is really important.
Great. Yeah, that rings true for me. So let's see. Maybe I'll try to go ahead and unmute the line so we can have people voice their questions or comments. Oh, good. There's not a lot of background noise. So maybe I'm wondering if anybody on the phone line has an experience they'd like to share about getting science put into practice. Andy, is there an example that you'd like to share from the Southwest Fire Science Consortium that you've seen in the last couple of years?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, not particularly from off the top of my head really fast from the consortium. I know there's like 50 of them, but I just wanted to say that I do very much agree with the idea of bringing managers and the scientists in from the beginning and even the development of the proposal for the research. I think that really makes a big difference in how much that it's used in the end, and I've seen that definitely increase with the consortium in the Southwest. So I think that's been a big factor that's helpful is these people are actually talking to each other beforehand, and so that they're planning these things together at the same time. Definitely some of the research, places where there's been controversy in the literature, I think, and maybe there's two sides to one of the stories, like do we have high severity fire in Southwest ponderosa pine forest? Being able to go through the literature and pull out that information and synthesize that in formats that are more easily understandable by managers, I think has made that a lot of the research associated with those pieces more understandable and more usable. And then I'm going to have to think for a minute, Xander.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot there. Other comments on getting science put into practice? I was wondering if, Chris Bowman, if you'd let me put you on the spot from the Great Basin and the experiences you guys have had in terms of playing that connector role and getting science on the ground.
I'm a PhD student, so I might want to defer that to my advisor, Beth Newingham. Who is apparently on the line.
Great. I think there's some questions coming in the chat window as well. And Ashwin comments that CAL FIRE has integration for integrating maps online, and whether that's going to be available for other regions. And that, let's see, I'll answer the second question first. Yes, this webinar will be recorded. The Google Maps piece, I think I'll have to respond, I don't know, but I can follow up on that. And Barb asked if we have any managers on the line. That's a great question. I'm looking down the list here to find people I can call out, but you can save yourself the embarrassment by just speaking up before I call you out. So if there are folks more on the management end of things or on the planning end, it would be great to hear your personal stories about trying to integrate science. Richard, is there anything that you want to comment on? I warned you I might call you out earlier.
Well, I'm kind of, I'm here on the webinar, and I told our staff here that, we'd have this posted and showing. I'm kind of preoccupied with more mundane aspects, like trying to get our agency approved to go to the fire ecology conference. I'm reviewing fire management plans and trying to get a regional annual monitoring summary out of here. So I'm kind of not really nothing really came to mind right away. I'll keep thinking, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And actually, Oh, go ahead.
Oh, Xander, this is Andy. I was just going to say, you know, one, and I don't have a lot of the specifics for this, but some of the folks on the call might, is one area where the management was really ahead of the science and that JFSP put a big call out for was mastication studies. And there's been a lot of mastication done, particularly in the Southwest on the Mogollon Rim and that area, and I know there's been a bunch done in Colorado. And there's been a lot learned in the field from that, but also there's been a big push on the research that's come out on that. And I think there's a lot of practices on the ground sort of changing relative to both what was learned in the research and what's been learned in practice being combined together. And I don't know if anyone has a real specific example for that in particular, but the thickness of the mulch has been a big issue because of the soil heating below and some of the information related to that.
That's a good example. So maybe I'll take the opportunity to make 2 points. One, I want to highlight Richard is an effective individual, gets a lot done, and yet he wears a lot of hats in his organization. And so the fact that he's so busy just during this webinar, I think highlights a nuance of some of the issues of getting science put into practice. And for me, that is, if we all are too busy to engage and make the time for a conference or a webinar or to interact, field trips take a lot of time. One of my concerns, and not that Molly or anybody else can answer this directly, but one of my concerns is that as organizations and budgets shrink, the ability to have the kinds of interactions that result in good science transfer are limited and more limited as we go further on in time. But then building on what you said, Andy, what it raises for me is the changes in practice around mastication not be driven by any one project, but because there was this emphasis on work and a number of things coming out and webinars and papers and conversations, that there was sort of this overall learning happening. And maybe, Molly, I'll pitch this back to you. Can you comment at all about how that gets tracked or measured and the difficulties of sometimes amorphous process like learning and trying to shoehorn it in? I mean, I think that's one of the nice things about your study is you managed to plug in a few boxes, but sort of presuming there might have been others that were harder to get into boxes.
Yeah, and I'm also kind of thinking along the lines of what Andy said in this particular example, where sometimes the management is ahead of the science. And just to bring in kind of a JFSP perspective, I see a lot that, you know, sometimes the organization plays a role of being behind the management and trying to address kind of questions that that managers are dealing with right now, and at other times they're really trying to focus on being forward thinking and thinking about science that might be applicable to managers in the future. And that's an important balance, because I think it's one of the things that we found in this study. So some of those studies that have not been used, I think one of the reasons is like, well, that came up is I could see using this in the future, but it's not quite relevant right now. That's one thing that came up that I didn't mention today. But so I don't know if that fully answered your question, Xander, but it's one of the things that I think the program grapples with a lot. And it's not, it shouldn't be either or, but it's a balance. You know? Yeah.
I know Corey had a comment. So Corey, I'll give you a little time here.
Thanks, Xander. I don't know if this is related or not, but it is. It is related that, you know, here at the university we do use the science that comes out of these projects to also sway business and community leaders that aren't actually related to fire activities or fire management, but the businesses either, you know, we approach them or sometimes they approach us asking for what is the most current science and how can we use it in our personal planning for our business or our community. And in that way, we have this extra opportunity to affect change in a different way in our community. And then it does trickle down to the manager, because those businesses then kind of hop on board with maybe some different kinds of treatments or management activities that they wouldn't have otherwise. And then we've also seen some new revenue streams for forest restoration come out of that work. So I think that's another area that this where science is being used really effectively by, what did you call them, boundary spanners, at least here at the university. I'm wondering if anyone else has any examples that sound like that.
I'm glad you raised that, Corey. I think certainly we're trying to make things like that happen. For example, in Santa Fe, where I'm based, in the Santa Fe fire shed. And I think probably one could point to the restoration bond in Flagstaff as a similar connection, or the Rio Grande Water Fund here in New Mexico, where the science, and sometimes it's not necessarily the most cutting edge science, although some of it does involve, well, maybe I'll just give this example from the Santa Fe fire shed, where Santa Fe, obviously we have a public that likes to get involved and has some time for public meetings and has some strong opinions. And so one piece of science that was crucial to moving forward towards maybe not full consensus, but at least some agreement around treatments, was work that Dr. Alice Margolis did on documenting locally specific fire regimes in the Santa Fe watershed. So that was, I don't know quite how it fits into the, it's not brand new kind of cutting edge science. It fits into our picture of how fire regimes in the Southwest work, but because, as Molly mentioned, it was local, it really has helped move the conversation forward and move towards some specific management outcomes. So I think you raise a very good point, Corey. Other people want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great point as well, and it's certainly not something that I looked at here. But I think it's an area that also would be, just ripe for new science as well. How does science get accepted by the public, this kind of fire science in particular, and what facilitates that? I think there's some great questions around that.
Other people have comments or questions they want to bring up? I'll throw out another of my personal curiosities that I think is related to the last conversation, and that is how science is rewarded. And much of science happens in an academic or quasi-academic, like Rocky Mountain Research Station framework, where scientists are rewarded for peer-reviewed publications and not necessarily for follow-up or the relationships they have with managers or participation in field trips so that science can get put on the ground, or maybe even those longer-term outcomes of, look, this community group is now using the science I produced. In many cases, scientists don't get any kind of remuneration for that. And so I wonder if anybody on the phone, and maybe I'll start with you, Molly, if you have any thoughts about that potential disconnect between how the rewards in science and getting it actually used on the ground. Is there a disconnect there, as I'm trying to claim, or is there maybe a better link than I imagine?
No, I think you're right, and of course we hear that a lot. The frustration with people that invest so much in science exchange that they don't really get much credit for it. But I think that's true in from an organizational perspective as well. I mean, you get judged by the numbers of things that you produce. But I have to say, I'm also, despite that, I'm always impressed by the amount of work that the people who are involved in these exchanges manage to do. And much of them are in academic appointments that don't get credit for this kind of stuff. But still, you can see the passion that's there, and I think it's great. So I certainly commend all the people that are involved in that, and even though I know it's a frustration.
Anybody else?
I think there is a very strong disconnect there, depending on the field that you're in. You know, and if you're in a forestry field or something like that that is inherently has an applied science piece to it, I think it's easier to be thinking about these pieces. I think people focus on it more. I think if you're in a pure biology department, or sometimes even just straight environmental sciences, I think some of those connections become harder because what is expected of you and what are the missions of those departments and their goals are very different. So there's definitely, but even in the forestry school, I can speak from experience, it's there's a tough row to hoe between balancing producing science and disseminating science.
Well, that's not the most optimistic place to end it, but maybe we.
Well, when I mean, I think people appreciate it too, though, and I do think, you know, I see a lot of support from people in the academic world on this. It's actually been a discussion in academia, and there's actually a paper written on what is scholarship and the points of scholarship, and that it really needs to be focused on helping to solve real-world problems, not just the standard research and science applications that we would have thought of in the past with universities. And there's been sort of a shift based on that. U of A actually bases their promotion and tenure piece partly on this idea of a broader perspective of scholarship. So it's changing.
Good. That's more helpful. Thank you, Andy.
There. Did you like that ending better?
Yes. And I can now tag on to that I personally find that that application aspect, that seeing things happen on the ground as maybe the most personally rewarding. So even if it isn't necessarily a career bonus, I think it can be what keeps us coming back to work instead of heading off to Tahiti.
And way more fun.
Well, so with that, I think maybe we'll wrap up. I want to thank everybody who participated, and particularly Molly, thank you for your presentation and the work you've done. And next month, as a little teaser, we will have later this month, later this month we have another webinar on the economics of home purchases in that wildland-urban interface. So I think will be another great discussion about issues that are sort of on the edge of fire science. So thank you all, and I'll share a recording with you once it's up and available.
Okay, thanks, Xander.
Okay, thank you, Molly. Bye.